Okay, I think we're live now. Welcome, friends and comrades. This is an event dedicated to the 25 years of Bolivarian socialism. 25 years ago, the Bolivarian Revolution, one of the most monumental events of the century, brought the working class to power in Venezuela. Since its inception, the US empire has used all of the weaponry in its imperialist toolbox in attempting to overthrow the popular revolution. From strict sanction regimes to the kidnapping of the revolution's leader, Hugo Chavez, the Chavistas have been able to sustain power in the hands of the people, fighting off the encroaching interests of the transnational imperialist bourgeoisie and its anti-patriotic bourgeois friends within Venezuela. Today, we convene with a group of scholars and organizers, both within and outside of the Chavista process, to discuss the achievements and the future of the Bolivarian Revolution. This event is co-sponsored by the International Manifesto Group, Venezuelanalysis, Orinoco Tribune, the Midwestern Marx Institute, and the Critical Theory Workshop. You can find all the relevant links in the YouTube description of this broadcast. I'm your moderator, Carlos Garrido. We will start today with 5 presentations from our guest speakers and then open up for audience questions, so stick around, you should enjoy it. Our first speaker is Edward Liger Smith. He's an American political scientist and director at the Midwestern Marx Institute. He is a historian of anti-imperialist and socialist projects and also writes on the American healthcare system and on the role Southern slavery played in the development of American and European capitalism. In his weight class, he is amongst the best wrestlers in the country, a sport which he coaches for full-time at Loras College. So Eddie, feel free to start your presentation.
Sweet. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here, especially since this is co-hosted by Orinoco Tribune and Venezuelanalysis. Those are two outlets that were important for me in my political development, as was the Bolivarian Revolution and learning about the Bolivarian Revolution in general, which is kind of what I'm going to focus my presentation on today. I'm sure some of the other speakers can give the ins and outs of Venezuelan politics and the revolution. So I thought I'd keep my presentation sort of short and sweet and sort of tell my story with learning about Venezuela, learning about the Bolivarian Revolution and how that pushed me to become a socialist when I was in college. So when I was a junior in college, I wanted to learn what socialism was in general. It seemed like common sense to me, focusing the labor and the resources of society on development, on education and healthcare rather than endless war. But what the roadblock that was in my head was this idea that socialism has failed every time it's been tried. Right? Socialism might seem like common sense, but look at Venezuela is the kind of talking points that I would hear at the time. That socialism is this great idea in theory, but in practice, capitalism is the only system that works. So young people like myself who express interest in socialism are often told to study economics in order to understand why socialism always fails. So I did. In my junior year in college, I signed up for macro and microeconomics class, and that microeconomics class was taught by a professor who was also the chairman of the local GOP and the head of my college's economics department. Um, She also used to dress up like Barbie once per year and bring Barbie cupcakes into class, which has nothing to do with the presentation, but I thought it was interesting anyways. But anyway, when I arrived at this microeconomics class, the head of the GOP professor informed me that she was a political junkie who loved to watch cable news. And she also installed in this class one lecture on the topic of socialism. And the lecture went about like this. She informed us that socialism fails every single time it's tried. She said, if you want to see an example of how socialism fails, just look at Venezuela. And then she argued that the economic crisis in Venezuela has been the direct result of socialist policies, which she said, according to her, those socialist policies were the government taking over the oil companies, giving all of the profits away to the people before the government then ran out of money, causing the economy to fail. That was her characterization of Venezuela. So even at the time, I didn't know that much about Venezuela, but this still seemed like an overly simplistic explanation to me that didn't really explain why the Venezuelan economy was in crisis. So earnestly, I asked my professor what she thought of U.S. economic sanctions on Venezuela and how that affects the Venezuelan economy. And out of hand, she just dismissed the question, saying that the sanctions may have had some effects, but for the most part, the Venezuelan economy failed because of socialism. So I asked next, if socialism always fails, why does the US have to sanction countries like Venezuela? Why can't we just allow these countries to fail on their own? She gave me some convoluted answer about Venezuela sponsoring terrorism and proceeded to loudly and rudely interrupt me as I tried to point out all the terrorist groups that the United States, in fact, backed around the world. She spent the rest of the class talking over me and any other kid who would challenge her on her worldview in what felt more like watching a Fox News segment than a lecture that I was paying thousands of dollars to attend. After class, she came over to me and told me that students in the past had accused her of speaking over them and trying to indoctrinate them with a certain ideology, but assured me that, in fact, that is not what she was doing. She didn't ask me if I felt like she was indoctrinating me. She just informed me that she wasn't. Needless to say, I left that class far less convinced that socialism had truly failed every time it's tried, and that studying economics would help me understand why. Here I was studying economics, and my economics professor still couldn't explain to me why socialism always fails. So after finishing that semester, I understood that the field of economics had not disproved the possibility of socialism, and the only ones who thought that it had were ideologically driven neoclassical economists who are arrogant enough to have convinced themselves of their own bullshit. I also left that class with the goal of studying Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution to find out the real story. And when I did, it would end up cementing in my head forever that socialism is the way forward for humanity and socialism is a superior economic system to capitalism. Because the Bolivarian Revolution did not fail, unless you consider it a failure for working people to seize state power from Western neocolonial puppets and seize sectors of the economy from hyper-exploitative Western multinational corporations in order to improve material conditions for millions of working people. Unless you consider vastly expanding healthcare access and building new hospitals to be a failure. Unless you consider decreasing malnutrition to be a failure, or building dozens of new schools, providing education to thousands of young people and higher education to many college students. Unless you consider it a failure to give thousands of elderly people pensions for the first time, allowing them to retire, which is what I think is one of the greatest material accomplishments of the Bolivarian Revolution in terms of improving the lives of the people, especially here, looking from here in the United States, where the retirement age is actually on the rise. Unless you consider combating inequality and deeply entrenched anti-indigenous racism in Venezuelan society to be a failure. Unless you consider creating new forms of popular democracy and giving the masses increased say in governmental affairs to be a failure. Unless you consider all of those things to be failures, the Bolivarian Revolution is not a failure. What the Bolivarian Revolution is, and the reason why the Western media has to portray it as a failure, is because it's been a constant thorn in the side of Western capitalist imperialists ever since Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 or even sooner. It's a socialist project that exists right under the nose of the United States empire in a country which refuses to be a subservient neocolony of the West. And you see that anytime Israel and Palestine are in the news, as I'm wearing my kafaya here. I was just reading Norman Finkelstein today when Israel was launching their assault on Gaza in 2014 in what's known as Operation Protective Edge. Some of the only country, Venezuela was one of the only countries in the world who stood up to the U.S. and stood up to Israel and called for an end to the slaughter of the people in Gaza. And that is why the U.S. empire hates the Bolivarian Revolution, not because socialism has failed or they're trying to protect human rights and democracy. This is why the U.S. tried to coup Hugo Chavez in 2002 before being thwarted by massive demonstrations from the Venezuelan masses. It's why the United States has put Venezuela under 166 crippling economic sanctions, which are enforced by American military personnel stationed all over the Caribbean and Colombia. This is also why they stole 4 Iranian oil tankers on their way to Venezuela back in 2020 and then brought them back to Houston and handed them over to American oil companies, which is interesting as the U.S. is now launching missile strikes at the Houthis in Yemen for blockading the Red Sea in order to stop a genocide. It's unreal hypocrisy if you look at the kind of economic strangulation that the U.S. has put Venezuela under, and the straight up international piracy that they engage in when any country like Iran tries to break the blockade and send resources to Venezuela. Venezuelan economic failures have largely been due to imperialist sabotage and the fact that the Bolivarian revolutionaries inherited a society which was riddled with contradictions and which was made dependent on the export of oil by years and years of colonial exploitation from Western imperialist powers and multinational oil corporations. This allows the U.S. sanctions to greatly hamper the overall Venezuelan economy by specifically targeting the oil industry. And this is what many right-wing ideologues, like my neoclassical professor, will try to blame on the socialist economy and on the socialist government and on the Bolivarian Revolution. They'll say, these stupid socialists don't know how to run an economy. Look, they made the economy dependent on oil. When in fact, the economy is only dependent on oil because British Dutch Shell and other giant companies extracted oil out of Venezuela for about a century, making the economy dependent on exports with what some people have called Dutch disease, which is an economic phenomenon where your country becomes incredibly dependent based on one export because of the prevalence of that export in the country. And of course, we know Venezuela has more oil reserves than any other country on earth. So yes, there's also other forms of economic sabotage, such as the U.S. luring skilled workers out of Venezuela, oftentimes through Colombia, trying to get all the engineers and other people who know how to run the oil industry, trying to lure them out of Venezuela. Any form of sabotage to the Venezuelan economy, the U.S. has engaged in. The U.S. absolutely hates what Venezuela stands for geopolitically, and what it stands for ideologically. So they want that material oil wealth of Venezuela. They want that for Western multinational corporations, but it's not just that. It's that the State Department and the capitalist ruling class here in the West, the finance capitalists, hate what Venezuela stands for. They hate that Venezuela stands up for Palestine when Israel's bombarding them. They hate the fact that there is an ideologically socialist country right under the nose of the empire, in the same sort of way that they hate Cuba. They hate having this anti-imperialist thorn in their side that exists in the same hemisphere as the United States, the hegemonic imperialist power in the world today. Geopolitically, Venezuela always refuses to go along with U.S.-sponsored regime change efforts and bombing campaigns. Last month, we saw Venezuela back South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the ICJ, which is just one of many examples of how Venezuela stands against U.S. interventionism and involvement around the globe. Ideologically, the American ruling class and their media cannot allow Venezuela to become a socialist success story, right? Because then not only do you have this socialist country, this anti-imperialist country right under your nose, but if their people are living better, or are improving their material conditions more than we are in the United States, then people in the United States might start looking to Venezuela and wondering why we don't have socialism here, which is a very good question to ask, actually. So they need to sabotage the revolution at every turn and convince the American public that socialism in Venezuela has failed. Otherwise, people may come to learn the truth, that socialism doesn't fail every time it's tried, and actually it can really help improve life for the vast majority of society. There's so much that we can learn from the Bolivarian Revolution. For one, it shows us the difficulties of building socialism and diverting the nation's surplus towards social development without a one-party state, especially. It shows us that progressive sections of the military can be useful allies in bottom-up revolutionary movements, which relates to the recent military coups that we've seen in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Gabon, Sudan, Guinea, and Chad. With all these anti-colonial military-led coups in Africa that are backed by the vast majority of the people, similar to the Bolivarian Revolution. And some people have argued that a leftist coalition similar to Venezuela's PSUV would be a good way forward in the United States. And I think, that's an idea that needs to be considered for sure. Every socialist project is an experiment that can be studied and learned from, both in their failures and in their successes. Regardless of what you think about the intra-Marxist debate surrounding the construction of socialism in Venezuela, we can all agree to stand against Western interventionism and regime change efforts in the region, which would only serve to hurt the Venezuelan masses. We can all agree to show solidarity with the Venezuelan masses and those who have been at the forefront of the class struggle for socialism in that country. And I hope we can also agree that my economics professor was wrong, both when she said that socialism failed in Venezuela and when she argued that the Venezuelan situation proves that socialism fails every time it's tried. In fact, socialism has worked in Venezuela. Every time that it's won out against the reactionary Venezuelan bourgeoisie and the US funded opposition. And no, Venezuela is not perfect. It's a product of class struggle, like any country, and it's still riddled with the contradictions of capital and years of colonial exploitation by the West. But the Bolivarian Revolution and those who brought it into realization are absolutely worthy of our support and admiration, as well as study. Let's continue to learn from the Bolivarian Revolution and support them against the Western imperialist regime change interventions.
Thank you so much, Eddie. That was terrific. Our next speaker is Cira Pascual Marquina. Cira is a political science professor at the Universidad Bolivariana de Venezuela in Caracas, a teacher and organizer at the Pluriversidad Patria Grande, el Panal Commune's educational initiative, and part of the Venezuelanalysis editorial team. She is also co-producer and co-host of the Marxist educational program Escuela de Cuadros, which, by the way, I absolutely love. I've mentioned it to her a few times already. Pascual Marquina, a member of the International Communal Democracy Network, is co-author of Venezuela in the Present as Struggle, Voices from the Bolivarian Revolution, a book published by Monthly Review Press, and co-compiler of two books, Para qué sirve el capital, un balance contemporáneo de la obra principal de Karl Marx, so what is capital good for, a contemporaneous analysis of Marx's work, and Por qué el socialismo reactivando un debate, why socialism reactivating a debate, both from Editorial Trinchera. Thank you so much, Cira, for being here, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you to all of you folks at Midwestern Marx that have organized this panel. It's really great to be with you and to be learning from everyone. So I wanted to focus my ponencia, my talk, on the commune as the strategic project of the Bolivarian Revolution. Of course, the commune comes to be as a full project in the Bolivarian process in 2009, but I actually think that the roots go much further. So I wanted to look at the roots and argue why the commune is the strategic project of the revolution. So basically, to make a synthesis of this strategic project in historical terms, well, there's a long history in this territory that we now know as Venezuela that has to do with communal relations. There's, of course, a theoretical base that I will be talking about briefly that goes back to Marx and Mesados that brings the commune forward. And of course, in Latin America, there's a long revolutionary history, a long revolutionary tradition that brings together popular power and anti-imperialism. So basically, communes today exist in Venezuela. They are real. They are spaces that you can actually visit and where you can see new social relations emerging. They prefigure the future society, and in that sense, they are super important. I think that the communes are not only important for the Bolivarian Revolution, but they are also the project of the communes is actually an important project for the revolutionary left worldwide, I would argue. Of course, it's true that the communes that exist right now in Venezuela, the majority of the Venezuelan society is not organized in communes. We could even say that sometimes in terms of the actual organization of the economy, which Chavez would often remind us that this is still a capitalist society with a bourgeois state. But so in terms of the whole economy of our society and of the whole political organization of our society, we could say that they are even fringe. But they are actually super important in the sense that we can actually see the future prefiguring in the existing communes in Venezuela. That's why I think we have to look at the communes right now. It's super important because it's kind of like easy to talk abstractly about socialism and about better living conditions to build together, but what are the mediations to get there? And of course, Chavez proposes that the commune would be kind of like our roadmap, at least Venezuela's roadmap, to build a socialist society. So he would say that basically the commune is the cornerstone of Bolivarian socialism, the roadmap to overcome the logic of capital. The origins of the commune, well, of course, the origins of the commune are not in Venezuela. Marx talks about the Paris Commune, but more importantly, he talks about the Russian communes, the Obshchina, and Engels talks and also studies communal organizations. There's the Soviets, there's the councils, the history of the councils, the Chinese communes. So there's a long history within our tradition, within our communist tradition of thinking and building communes in some cases. Here in Venezuela, we have the privilege of actually being in a context where we are building communes. So first there's that, but then there's also, when we go specifically to the Bolivarian process, I would go back to year 1991, when Chavez, 1991, 1992, when Chavez writes El Libro Azul, the Blue Book, which is a book where he proposes participative and protagonic democracy, so direct, substantive democracy, but he proposes it focusing on the political aspects. He doesn't have kind of like an overall perspective on how to transform a society, because of course Chavez was a human being that developed with the Bolivarian process too. So in 1991, Chavez writes this book, which basically he proposes in some sense as the he proposes participative and protagonic democracy as the alternative to the tyranny of capital, we would say now, but to the tyranny, he would say, that's disguised, as democracy, as what we would call liberal democracy. So that's 1991. Chavez is already thinking about a radical reorganization in political terms. Of course, as we all know, by 2004, Chavez declares the Bolivarian process anti-imperialist, and by 2006, socialism of the 21st century. But I actually would like to go a little bit further even to really understand the proposal of the Bolivarian communes, because, and this, while we are focusing on Venezuela, I think that, of course, all societies will have seeds of past formations, past social formations that are still alive in our present, and those seeds are very important. That's why, of course, Marx studies the Obshchina, the Russian commune. So we could trace back our communes in some senses back to the community pre-Columbian legacy. So the Arawaks and the Caribs, the peoples that lived in these territories before colonization, they were egalitarian societies. In colonial times, later in colonial times, the Cumbes, the Maroon communities, were profoundly egalitarian and democratic societies where property was social and they were assembly-based organizations. So these Maroon communities, which were very, very powerful in the 19th century, of course, they were on the fringes of society, but they were very robust. These organizations actually have left us something. These cultural forms of organization, cultural, political, and economic forms of organization have left us something that we can see in present times. And then, well, in the 19th century in Venezuela, in addition to the independence war, but there were also the so-called federal wars, where Zamora and the people, like the working masses, the campesinos, rebelled against the regime, and basically in these 19th century wars, there was an elimination of the elites in Venezuela, which was very, very, very radical. This is also part of our history, and therefore part of the current construction of communes. But then, so if you go to today, if we travel to today, where do we see these elements of egalitarian formations in our society? Well, we see them, actually, it's very easy to see them. Venezuela, if you come here, you will see that this is a very anti-authoritarian society. For instance, the formal usted is practically never used here, as in other neighboring countries, which is very common. And the practices of solidarity are day to day, are quotidian. For instance, the callapa, which is actually an indigenous term. The callapa is when people from a community organize to solve some problem, like clean the streets or fix a school, etc., etc. So there's all these actual forms, existing forms of communality that we can find in Venezuela today. And actually, I always like to tell this anecdote, but I think that this is a very good demonstration of the kind of like solidarity of Venezuelan society. Other than insulting one's mother, the worst insult that you can say to somebody in Venezuela is that they are pichirri. That means that they are not generous. Somebody who's pichirri is like, that's just like the worst. If you are not generous, that's just like the worst person possible. So these points again to kind of like form social elements, social cultural elements that tribute and that lead to the current construction of communes. In theoretical terms, well, as I was saying, of course, the late Marx reflects on the pre-capitalist formation of the communes in Russia. There's, in our tradition, in the Marxist tradition, there's the Marxist communes. Chavez called everybody to read the book about the Qingli Commune. And most importantly, perhaps in theoretical terms, Chavez had a very long-standing relationship with Mesaros, with a Hungarian philosopher. Actually, since Chavez was right out of jail, and even while he was in prison after the insurrection, after the 4th of February insurrection, he was already in conversation with Mesaros. What is the interesting thing that Mesaros proposes? Well, Mesaros proposes that, of course, Mesaros doesn't say this, I say this, well, there's a lot to learn from real socialism, from East Bloc socialism. There obviously were some problems as well. And so we have to study the shortcomings of 20th century socialism, where basically, while there was no exploitation, there was also no direct participation of broad sectors of society. So Mesaros argues that the logic of capital prevailed in not capitalism, but the logic of the despotic logic of capital prevailed in the East Bloc exercises, in those wonderful but also limited exercises in the construction of socialism. So if they ultimately didn't last over time, we have to figure out what was the limitation of those projects. And the anti-democratic logic of those projects is precisely what Mesaros proposes that has to be brought back to the table. And when we are talking about democracy, of course, democracy from a Marxist perspective has to be widely understood. It's participation of the people, it's social control of the means of production, it's social participation in terms of how the surplus is distributed, etc., etc. So when we go back to Marx was thinking this stuff. There's real socialism with its virtues and its limitations. There's Mesaros and Chavez with this big commitment with democracy and with a call to making socialism, and this very fluid conversation between the two guys. So it's very interesting to read Mesaros, because with Mesaros, with Chavez, we kind of like bring together again a full picture of what it is to build socialism, like with all its components, for lack of a better word at this moment. So the communist is a space where non-alienated labor emerges, where it should be a pleasure to work, where you break down the social and technical division of labor, And of course, doing that, you not only overcome capitalism, but also the capital system. This is a little bit about kind of like the history that brings us here and the theory, but of course we have to talk about the big objectives of the commune. The commune is about the democratization of life and the democratization of the economy, the democratization of all aspects of life, in short. So the commune is an anti-capitalist, rupturist project that goes to the root causes not only of exploitation, which it does, but also of all other forms of oppression. It proposes a new metabolism, and basically it proposes to go from what we propose as communists, right? So to go from the realm of the private, of where everything is centered against accumulation, private accumulation, to the realm of the common, or to the realm of communism. Something very important about the commune, because so especially when we are among comrades who are probably mostly in the U.S., is to highlight that the Venezuelan proposal, Chavez's proposal, and Venezuelan people's proposal for the commune is not a small, kind of like beautiful and isolated project. It is, as I said in the beginning, a strategic project. This is a strategic project for the whole of Venezuela, and hopefully for beyond our borders too. So Chavez often said, well, yeah, he said it in a couple of occasions. He said it in Diálogo Presidente Teórico número uno, where he first talked about the communes in a full sense. He said, lo local, limitado a lo local, puede llegar a ser contrarrevolucionario. That which is local, which limits itself to the local, can actually be counter-revolutionary. And of course, he was looking at many experiences, many global experiences that are kind of like wonderful at a small scale, but that do not transcend the project at a large scale. So the commune has to go beyond the small scale. Of course, the communes are assembly-based, direct democracy-based. In the communes, and I work in communes. I mean, I'm part of a commune, and I also am doing a long-term project, kind of like documenting how communes are working. In the communes, basically, these spaces where are democratically assembly-based, organized, property is social, or property should tend to be social. And one very important thing to highlight is that in the communes, it is decided collectively, not only what we are going to produce, how we are going to produce, how we are going to organize work, but also it's important to highlight that in communes, it's decided collectively what to do with the surplus. So there enters the profoundly democratic aspect in economic terms of the commune. So communes are, of course, not profit-driven. They are driven by the society, by the needs of the society, and through democratic control. And basically, when we look at the commune, I want to encourage all of you who are listening, because this is just like a very brief introduction. There are some texts. Well, there's a speech by Chavez, which I mentioned before, which is Diálogo Presidente Teórico número uno, where Chavez actually went in depth about how to organize a commune. And of course, there's the strike at the helm. The strike at the helm speech from 2012 is where Chavez says comuna o nada, basically commune or nothing. And that's a profoundly philosophical reflection. No, it's like, what options do we have today? It's either the despotism of capital, war, death, oppression, exploitation, and of course environmental disaster and crisis, or we have to reorganize in a radically different way society, and that's where the commune comes in. Let me know how am I with time? I haven't been timing myself. Carlos, if
A
you
little
could
bit
tell me,
over, but you were
I'm
a
at
little bit
how
over.
long?
You could feel free to finish if you'd like.
Okay, so I will highlight a couple of things very quickly, where does the commune come from? In 2006, Chavez talks about the communal councils, which are grassroots organizations in the territory where 100 to 500 households organized in an assembly-based space. But the communal councils do not have the capacity to transform the society as a whole, because they focus on solving specific problems on a territory. So in 2009, in the El Presidente Teórico that I was mentioning before, Chavez develops fully the proposal of the commune. In 2010, there's the law of communes, which is also very important. So communes bring together several, I'm actually talking about the structure, bring together maybe 8 to 25 communal councils. They are not, however, just a sum of a bunch of councils where things are taken, where decisions are taken in an assembly space. No, because communes, as I was saying before, have social property, have means of production, and have collective control over their territory, over their production, over the surplus. I would like to finish by mentioning that, as I said before, not only do I work am I part of a communal project. So in that sense, I could be biased. I am part of El Panal Commune, and I'm part of a project that I'm really committed to. But I work with many other communes around the country, and we've been putting together in Venezuelanalysis a series of long interviews with communards, from communes from actually 10 or 12 communes up to now from all around the country. It's extraordinary to go to commune. Look, things in Venezuela are really difficult because the US blockade is criminal. And it's true, things are really difficult. But not only are the communes a place where you can imagine a better future and where you actually see the emergence of new social relations, but actually in the present, in this very, very difficult present that we are living, the communes actually offer real solutions to people. I mean, people at the worst of the blockade, people had problems even to bury their loved ones. Things were really, really difficult. Things are still difficult. But communes, when you lived in a commune, you knew that the commune would, if you had such a problem, work with you to solve it, etc., etc. So I would encourage everybody to look at the Venezuela's communal project, because it is, for me, the sum of the Bolivarian process of these 25 years that we are celebrating today. There are different texts that perhaps I will share with you at the end, but there are specifically two texts that I would like to share with you. There's a recent book by Chris Gilbert that's called Commune or Nothing, published by Monthly Review, and you cannot see it because I have this funny blur. If I put it further, I don't know. It's a beautiful
Try
cover.
putting it like in front of your shirt. See if it, because I think the blur surrounds you. There we go.
That's it. Okay, so there's this book. It's in English. I mean,
I
there's
linked it to
nothing
the
to
chat, by
share.
the way, so everyone can
That's
see
good.
what first.
And I really recommend it because it's written in English. So and then there's another book that Venezuelanalysis put out, which is, I will do the same thing. Actually, I could put it higher, which is called A War Without Bombs, which is about the political, economic, and social impact of the U.S. criminal U.S. sanctions regime against Venezuela. That can be downloaded from the Venezuela analysis page. It's something that I would like to talk more about, the impact of the blockade. And in that sense, I would like to ask all of you who are listening to, I don't know, write to your senators or to congressmen or however you do that stuff in the United States, because the U.S. blockade has to come down. So that's all. And I'm sorry about the length of the presentation.
No, that was fantastic. I put the link to both of those books in the chat. Someone had already asked about any relevant books on the commune, so I had put a couple suggestions there. As a Marxist philosopher, I always find it very interesting what parts of Marx and Engels' oeuvre is adapted by various parts of the world. And what I've seen is that from Latin America, those insights that come from Marx's engagements with Maxim Kovalevsky, the debates with the Populates, Mikhailovsky, the letter to Sasulich, and other works rooted in these deeply ethnological and anthropological studies are always captured and used to give Marx's analysis a determinate form, a specific content that's adapt to the unique conditions of the country developing the struggle for socialism. So I think you explained that very well, how it occurs in Venezuela with the commune. Our next speaker is Saheli. Saheli Shodhuri. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that. Oh, I pronounced it good, good. Is a co-editor and contributor of Orinoco Tribune. She is a Bengali socialist interested in anti-imperialist struggles throughout the world, and especially in the global south. So, Saheli, thank you very much for being here, and you can start your presentation.
Thanks a lot to Midwestern Marx Institute for holding this wonderful event. Like in memory of 25th anniversary of the Bolivarian Revolution, that in my opinion is something that shook the world. Yes, I'll really talk about that, the geopolitical impact of the Bolivarian Revolution. But first, I would like to thank every organizer and especially Carlos Garrido for inviting me to this, what I call a very illustrious panel. Okay, so like I said already, I would like to talk about how the Bolivarian Revolution is viewed, I would say, from the East, because that is my original point of view. The Bolivarian Revolution, I would say, placed Venezuela on the international geopolitical scenario. That is, it made people in different parts of the world interested in what is happening in Venezuela, and even interested in its existence in a way, that a country called Venezuela exists, and that it exists is important. And I know it sounds weird, but if you are from a country that is not the US or the UK or Canada or even Russia or China, you would realize what I am talking about. Now, coming to more specific terms, for me, the Bolivarian Revolution signifies decolonization in various aspects. But as I already mentioned, I would focus on Venezuela's position in the international scenario after the triumph of the revolution. The Bolivarian Revolution inspired peoples around the world. Now, it's known that in the immediate vicinity of Venezuela in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's very well known, but it also inspired peoples in other side of the world as well. I mean, Asia and Africa. It inspired people to believe in people's power, to break free from the system of neocolonialism that was imposed on us through neoliberalism after the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. And I'm mentioning this because this has been mentioned by Cira Pascual just before me. So yes, the 1990s was actually a very difficult time, not only for the left globally, but also for the third world. And here I just digress a bit and say that a lot of people do not like the term third world, but I use this term proudly because it refers to defeating centuries of colonialism and charting a new path for a new world of development, dignity, and independence, because it was from the idea of third world that the non-aligned movement arose and the tricontinental came about. So in the 1990s, it was a time of setback, not only for the left, but also for the third world as a whole, because one after another, our countries were steamrolled by neoliberalism, although it did not want it. Just after a few years, when we had some breathing space, because most of the countries of Asia and Africa just got independence in the 50s, 60s, and even in the 70s or 80s. So our countries had just a little bit of breathing space. And then, their governments were either overthrown during the period of neoliberalism, or the governments just adapted themselves into being vassals of the West again. So therefore, when Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela in 1999, it was as if the belief returned to us that a different world was possible. Now, the principal factor that connects the Bolivarian Revolution to the East, especially Asia and Africa, is what I just call it a look east policy. By this, I mean that turning away from receiving orders from the North to stop being a vassal of the US empire, as Venezuela mostly had been during its democratic period of the Fourth Republic, or even before that, during the dictatorship, or before that as well, for the most part. So the Bolivarian Revolution was the main promoter of this South-South cooperation in the 21st century, with Venezuela developing strong and lasting relationships with China, Russia, and Iran. I mentioned these countries because these are the, well, strongest emerging powers in many aspects. And these relations were based on mutual respect and understanding. Unlike the relation of subordination, what had been with the US, or what the US demands of its allies. So President Chavez was the first president of Venezuela who considered Asia to be important. So he realized that future lies in Asia. And he was the first president of Venezuela and one of the very few heads of state of Latin America who visited a series of Asian countries, especially in West Asia, but also in the South, to develop strategic relationships with many of them. And I mentioned Iran, which came to a lot of use during the worst years of the US blockade. I remember that Eddie mentioned about Iranian oil. So during the worst time of the blockade, a lot of Iranian oil actually came to Venezuela and just, tried to keep the country afloat. And it also helped during the blackouts in 2019. So, and also last year, that is 2023, China upgraded its relation with Venezuela to what it calls an all-weather partnership, which is a very rare thing that China does with very few countries. So in this sense, I would say that Chavez was a visionary, just like Che Guevara had been, who had cemented Cuba's relations with Asia and Africa. Now, this is on the geopolitical, physical world, but I would say that in the mental level also, Bolivarian Revolution has boosted a process of decolonization. Now, what do you mean by this? When your people have been colonized for centuries, you are just programmed to consider your colonizers to be better than you, to be more knowledgeable, to be cleverer, and even civilized, because that is how colonialism has been presented to us and is still presented to us. The West is presented to us as a civilizing mission. So this is a Marxist space, so I would say that the dominant culture is the culture of the ruling class. And in case of colonized countries where colonialism is the primary contradiction, even if the countries are no longer colonized, politically speaking, the dominant culture remains that of the colonizer. So you are bound to consider, because that is the system in which you were born and brought up, you are bound to consider your colonizers as the font of all knowledge, and you end up trying to emulate them, or you are forced into emulating them. So the Bolivarian, this thing is what I call colonial hangover. Now, Bolivarian Revolution challenged this hangover as well, and it put into practice a decolonization in this regard, which actually bore fruit during the years of the blockade in Venezuela I'm talking about. And since Cira Pascual Marquina talked so much about the communes, I in my opinion, in my view, that is, these communes are actually a fruit of this mental decolonization as well. So I'll say that Venezuela is still standing despite the relentless and ongoing US hybrid war, that consists of so many sabotage attempts and more than 930 sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, let us call them by their real name. So these things, despite all these things, Venezuela is still standing, unlike many other countries, all respect to them. And while there are many factors that have contributed to the Venezuelan resistance, the ongoing process of mental decolonization is surely one of them, it seems to be. So it's made the people believe in themselves, and it gives us the hope that the same would be possible in other parts of the world as well. And, the Bolivarian Revolution coming at the end of the 20th century, at a time when progressive forces worldwide were in a state of shock or a state of withdrawal, or were fighting to protect themselves. So in this time, Bolivarian Revolution also made us rethink revolutionary strategies and demonstrated that there is no unique way of making a revolution possible. It depends on your conditions, and you have to take your conditions into account in order to make a revolution possible. And it also showed that a revolutionary force could learn from its past failures and regroup and return triumphant with a different strategy. So it actually brought hope of recovery, and it was this hope that triggered a chain of revolutionary processes in Latin America, among which I would like to highlight the Bolivian revolutionary process, the return of Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and Nicaraguan millennials actually say this, that yes, it was the Bolivarian Revolution that inspired Sandinistas in a very deep way. And, the return of Peronismo in Argentina, although at the moment there is some problem there. And all the rejection of the free trade of the Americas, the FTA, which was a people's victory. So basically, I would say that the Bolivarian Revolution triggered the first pink tide, and it also kept the light of revolution burning during the years of the destruction of the first pink tide in the second decade of this millennium. So I'm sure that others will talk about all this so much better than me, or we could talk about all these things later in the Q&A period that you have. And we could also talk about the Petrocaribe that Venezuela did to bring about the regional integration, as well as upgrading the quality of life in the Caribbean, like a lot of things, education, healthcare, decreasing poverty. So Venezuela is not only, the Bolivarian Revolution was not only trying to upgrade the quality of life of the people of Venezuela, but also thinking about the peoples of the region, the entire region, as well as the world, because it connected with other parts of the world. So we'd talk about that later. So I'd just stop there. I would only say that in 1990, we were told that history had ended, but the Bolivarian Revolution is proof, and it is one among many proofs that history continues to be written by the people. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Aheli, for a wonderful presentation that really points out how it is that breaking from the imperialist value system allows you to develop an anti-colonial esprit de corps of sorts for these popular revolutionary movements. Our next speaker is Comrade Jesus Rodriguez Espinosa, who is an expert in international relations, Venezuelan politics, and communication. He served for several years as Consul General of Venezuela in Chicago. Before that, he was part of the foundational editorial team of aporrea.org. He is the founder and editor of the Venezuelan anti-imperialist news outlet Orinoco Tribune. Thank you so much, Comrade Jesus, for being here, and you can go ahead and speak whenever you want.
Thank you for the invitation, Carlos. And thank you for the wonderful work that you are doing up there in the belly of the beast. I just want to try to reflect on the things that has been already said about the Bolivarian Revolution. For example, the fact that in recent years, people in the North use us as an example of how bad communism or socialism is. And on that point, I believe that it's important to say that the Bolivarian Revolution began on February 2nd, 1999, and it has transit several stages. You know what I mean? And in the current one, of course, we are facing the most daring circumstances, mostly because U.S. blockade and U.S. sanctions. But before this current daring period, the Bolivarian Revolution showed the world and showed Venezuelans that change was possible and that improving the conditions of life of the majority was possible. You know, if a revolutionary government took the helm of the country. So I want to highlight that because media, especially in recent years, they try to use this narrative of the the failures of communism or socialism, and the truth is that they are using only recent years circumstances to support that, and they forget. I mean, they erase everything positive that the Bolivarian Revolution have done since 1999. And I believe that it's important to highlight that, because that is those positive years, those years at the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, in my opinion, are the base for the still very strong support that Chavismo has still right now in Venezuela. And of course, with that, the anti-imperialistic character of the Bolivarian Revolution and the resistance and not being submissive to imperialist dictates from the US or Europe. So I believe that all those things combined are the most important ingredients for Chavismo to still being alive and kicking. And not too many people talk about that, but that's a fact. I mean, Chavismo is the most important political force in Venezuela, disregarding whatever you hear, disregarding all the setbacks, all the desertions, all the difficult circumstances that we have been living in recent years. Chavismo is the strongest force in Venezuela. And I believe that is very important to highlight that, because a lot of people believe what they read in mainstream media about how bad Maduro is and how he wants to stick to power just because of the pleasure of having power or whatever. And they don't understand that Maduro is just the reflection or an instrument of something bigger that is Chavismo. So I believe that it's important to highlight that. I also believe that it's important, going back to what Sahili was saying about some achievements from the Bolivarian Revolution in continental, Latin American terms. The implication of the Bolivarian revolutions are tremendous. I mean, the concept of Patria Grande was brought back by Chavez. And not too many people believe in that or hear about that before Chavez, even though the concept is previous to him, of course. But he brought it back, and a lot of people in the continent in Latin America began to realize how chauvinistic approaches towards nationality and nation and petit lo que nosotros llamamos en Spanish patrioterismo, petit patriotism. I don't know how to say in English, but
Super patriotism is the term that
maybe yes,
one of our
maybe,
leading
and
Marxists
that happened,
called
and that happened a lot in Latin America, and that was inoculated to us by the US and by the Europeans, and that's placing the favor. And a lot of people, is sad, but a lot of people in our countries in Latin America, and I believe that all over the world, fall into that trap of chauvinism that divide us and that make us be more easily subjected to imperialist, tactics. So the concept of Patria Grande, of an only nation from Argentina to Mexico, including the Caribbean, is a very important concept that was brought back by Chavez, and not only in the rhetoric way. He brought it back in material terms with touchable projects like Sahili mentioned Petrocaribe or Alba TCP or UNASUR or Telesur, even, in the communication, in the journalistic communicational way. So I mean, there were material projects that were developed by Chavismo around the continent that I believe are very important to highlight. And that's also that has the sign of Chavismo. And talking about I agree with what Cira say about the communes, because I'm convinced that the communes are the jewel of the crown, if you ask me, in terms of the real material tools that Chavismo developed, not only again in the rhetoric way, but also in concrete projects that were developed and are still being developed in Venezuela, and with the communes, the possibility of real socialism, of real communism. I believe that is, is one of the most important tools to achieve that. Of course, for that you need a strong state. I don't like there are certain approaches, anarchistic approaches toward commune that I believe that might be, disintegrating in sort of way that Cira mentioned, and that's why Chavez and the Chavismo project talk about the commune, because because of that possibility of degradation that are embedded, for example, in the communal councils. If you broad the scope of those communal councils and create communes, that will make the project more sustainable and more viable. So I believe that it's very important also to highlight that, because at the end of the day, if you are a Marxist, you believe that the power, the economic power, and the political power should be in the hands of the people and not of the state, but eventually, we eventually will reach that, ideal level of communism, but meanwhile, you also need a strong state. So I believe that's the things that I wanted to mention. Of course, I can talk a little bit about the political situation right now, and we are right now facing a very strong. Just to close, I want to mention that we are facing a new aggression of the U.S. in recent weeks. Terrorist plots were unveiled by the government involving again U.S. intelligence agencies and local far right politicians, even those ones that are part of the Barbados Agreement, and of course the government should act and put and is running detentions of those involved in those terrorist plots, and that have bring some of the sanctions that were lifted a few months ago, partially lifted. The U.S. has been threatening us to bring them back, and Venezuela has been saying the word and telling the gringos that we don't care about that we have been able to solve this crisis with our own means, and that if the sanctions resume, we are still going to be able to keep the economic recovery path. And Chavismo, and it's important to highlight that, we're going to have elections at some point this year, presidential elections, and Chavismo surely will be able to win again the presidency of Venezuela with, I'm pretty sure that with President Maduro again as the candidate of the PSUV, which is the most important party of Venezuela right now. So I'm not sure if I talk too much, but I hope that that helps people.
No, thank you, Jesus. That was excellent. That point you make about the regional component of the Chavista process and the recapturing of the concept of La Patria Grande, the great homeland, is so important. As Nkrumah teaches us in the context of Africa, the imperialists succeed by balkanizing, by separating. And the antidote to that is unity. In Africa, it looks like Pan-Africanism. in Nuestra América, our America, as Martí called it. It looks like a united Patria Grande against the America that we're in right now, the belly of the beast. But our next speaker is Danny Shaw. Danny teaches Latin American and Caribbean studies at the City University of New York. He works as a director and professor at the Midwestern Marx Institute's International Department and as an international affairs analyst for Telesur, RT, Press TV, and other international news networks. He's the author of 6 books, including the forthcoming poetry book called 48 Poems for Gaza, 75 Questions for Israel. Danny has also been leading throughout the last 3+ months of Israel's intensified genocide against the people of Gaza, a wonderful class called Educate Against Genocide, which has been teaching about the history of Palestinian struggle, the history of Zionist settler colonialism, and has brought many prominent guest teachers along. So I think that the class is still going on. So if anyone wants to sign up for that, maybe Danny can say a word or two about that. But Danny, thank you so much for coming on, brother. And you can start your presentation whenever you want.
Anti-imperialist greetings to all the presenters and compañeras and compañeros. I just came back from Haiti. Haiti is going through one of its toughest moments, but the Haitian anti-imperialist leadership always reminds us of the sacred solidarity that exists with Venezuela in one of its most difficult moments. Just as the Haitians were there for the Gran Colombia project after the 1804 revolution. So I'll lay out how they continue to wage a hybrid war, a multifaceted war on Venezuela, a war that we never hear about in the corporate press. And then in the second half of my talk, I'll talk about the advances of the Bolivarian Revolution and why we will never hear one positive word from the corporate media about Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, and Nicaragua until they can, as they continue to try to overthrow those systems. So the informational war, as Jesus was beginning to lay out, the informational war against Venezuela is alive and well, arguably sharper than ever. That follows a continuum of 25 years of a savage media attack on Venezuela. The latest piece that they're using is Maria Machado and her candidacy. And I think it'd be important to look at constitutional law in the United States if we're going to contextualize Machado's candidacy. The Constitution here stipulates Article 3, Section 3, that any candidate for office. Where can I speak?
We have glass in the middle. You can speak.
Where? Upstairs?
Yeah. Upstairs.
Okay. I gotta move location, so someone cover me for 3 minutes. They said I'm too loud.
Danny has been in a protest for Palestine, so he had to sneak into a nearby library to speak to us. He's someone who is not only an avid scholar and writer and broadcaster of these issues, debunking the imperialist narratives, but he's also as avid of an activist as I've ever met in my life. This man is in the streets a few times a week, and it's extremely admirable and the product of this 3-minute disconnection is the fact that he conjoins what we would hope all scholars to have, which is one foot in the tables, doing the writing, doing the scholarly work, and another foot in the street, being with the people, learning from the people, and working amongst them for collective projects. But for those that are watching us live, whether it's through YouTube or through the Zoom, after Danny's presentation, we're going to have an open question segment, which will last, maybe 30 minutes or so. So if you can start preparing those questions, start writing them down so that you're ready to go whenever the time comes. I will also be pulling up questions from YouTube. I'll be active looking at the YouTube chat to see if there's any questions over there. So for those of us watching through YouTube, make sure to shoot your questions in as well. And you can ask a question that's just general in character that the panelists can address, those that want to, or you can ask specific questions about any specific panelist presentation. But yeah, so we'll give it a minute or two for Danny to relocate. He's got the great John Brown there on the screen. But yeah. Let's just wait a minute or two for Danny to relocate.
I can try, Carlos, to get a little bit into what Danny was saying, to
Yeah, that would be
distract
great. That's right. Thank you.
people. I mean, Danny was about to talk about. He was actually talking about the current, events surrounding the disqualification of Maria Corina Machado, and I believe that, as he said, this is the most recent. I mean, narrative, or I don't know how to say it, the trend that the gringos are pushing to sabotage Venezuela and Chavismo, the Bolivarian Revolution. So what happened, just to make it briefly, is that Maria Corina Machado has been disqualified to run for public office uh, for several years already, but most recently last year, the Controller General Office announced that he was still disqualified because of many violations that, as Danny was mentioned, in the US or any other country should have people behind bars already. I mean, but in Venezuela's dictatorship, she is still outside, kicking and sabotaging and organizing plots and coups and everything, and no one does anything against her, despite this disqualification that is the least a state should do in order to sanction someone that has been violating any kind of rules. And it's also important to say that before going forward, that Machado is a fabrication. It's almost the same as Guaido. Guaido is worse, of course, because Guaido was no one. I mean, he was no one politically talking.
He teaches democracy now at the University of Miami.
Yes, I don't know how that university can work with that, because for us, Spanish speakers, it was already hard to understand what Guaido said. And that's why his own people put captions in Spanish, I mean, subtitles, to let people understand what he was saying for us Spanish speakers. So I don't know how it will be him teaching. I believe that he doesn't have English, so I believe that he will be teaching some classes in Spanish. But anyway, the point is that Maria Corina Machado is also a fabrication. It's an artificial construct. Of course, she has been longer in politics, in far-right politics in Venezuela, and she is very well known, and she's from one of the richest families in Venezuela that make a lot of money out of the previous government at the beginning of the 20th century. And that is the Machado family, that is called in Venezuela, that is among what we call in Venezuela, Los Amos del Valle, which are the oligarchic families, the most important oligarchic families in Venezuela. So she's a fabrication. She doesn't have the support that you hear in the media, in mainstream media, that she has. Stop me whenever Danny comes out.
Danny's back,
I'm
by
back.
the way.
I'm back.
Okay,
I'm back.
okay. So I'm switching off. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, so how symbolic that I was told I could speak where I was. It seems as soon as they heard the word Venezuela and anti-imperialism, suddenly they had recalculated. So here I am, displaced but stronger than ever. So the hypocrisy of U.S. Democracy, in big quotation marks, that the Constitution stipulates that somebody like Maria Machado, who has advocated for sanctions against her own people and who has asked for regime change, has asked the United States to invade, of course, this would be called traición. She would be considered a traitor, according to the U.S. Constitution, which stipulates that she would face execution, among other penalties. Though once they've killed you, I'm not sure what other penalties are worth going over. So again, the hypocrisy of the U.S., the diplomatic war against Venezuela, trying to weaponize a faux sense of Guyanese nationalism, and then the Brits sending warships to further encircle Venezuela. Of course, the military war that different compas have talked about. The U.S. has 9 military bases in Colombia and 11 military bases in Panama. They're working closer and closer with the Ecuadorian state and extra state actors to destabilize the region. Eddie talked about the economic sabotage when the Iranians have tried to trade with the Venezuelans, how quick the U.S. Coast Guard, the true pirates of the Caribbean, were to intervene and to abduct those ships, which really didn't just fly the flag of Iran and Venezuela, but the flag of all of humanity and anyone who believes in the rise of a multipolar world. One thing that I think is overlooked, of course, Jesus and Cira and the compas who live in Venezuela know this all too well, but here in the U.S., there's such a steady indoctrination against the Bolivarian Revolution that we may lose sight that many Bolivarians, many Chavistas within Miranda and within Maracaibo and Vargas, they themselves, just for being Chavistas, just for being revolutionaries, just for being anti-imperialists, face some of the stiffest repression within Venezuelan society, because as Hugo Chavez reminded us, it was still not a socialist or a communist society. It was a process. So there's so many different Venezuelan teachers and students that just because of their political beliefs on social media, they have to hide their identities as Chavistas. So similar to the Zionists, who always say that they're the big victims, the bourgeois forces, the oligarchs, the right wing, los amos del valle, as Jesus said they're called, continue to try to flip social reality on its head. Another form of economic sabotage, the colonizers of yesteryear who don't want to give up their grip on neo-colonial control. The Bank of England seized $2 billion in Venezuelan gold. I mean, imagine the imperialist hubris to do these things. The importance of the resistance within Venezuela to this media war, to this social media war, which tries to present always 42nd Street in Miami as the highest zenith of capitalist civilization, in the measures that the Venezuelans took so that it wasn't just this outside foreign music and social media coming in. The Venezuelans did everything to make sure that there was a folkloric spirit and homegrown music so that they could resist what Saheli called the mental colonization of their people. So I'm going to list some of the bullet points, some of the reasons why imperialism continues to hate Venezuela and Venezuela's leadership. And we'll never say one positive word in the New York Times or in any bourgeois outlet until they're able to, which they'll never be able to hopefully do. But they, of course, want regime change in Venezuela because they can't control Venezuela. So Eddie very eloquently covered Venezuela's internationalism. They've long stood with the Palestinian people. Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro will go on any radio station, any television station, and document what the U.S. has done to Libya, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, destroying huge swaths of the Middle East. And it's this fearlessness, the fact that they refuse to be títeres or puppets that they can never forgive. I was in Managua. I was teaching in Nicaragua in 2005 when Telesur was formed. It was an incredibly exciting moment, not just for the Venezuelans, but for all South Americans, all the entire global South, the entire anti-imperialist world, that Telesur could be the CNN of the oppressed, and that Caracas could be this revolutionary epicenter to build people's democracy. Caracas has always taught us that the future for South America and the Caribbean does not go through Miami. It doesn't go through Wall Street in New York City. It doesn't go through DC. The future goes through Lima and Port-au-Prince and Havana and Santiago de Chile, building that Patria Grande. Ernesto Che Guevara talked about how capitalism converts all of society into a gigantic school of capitalism. And what we see in Venezuela, not to the extent perhaps that we see it in Cuba, because Cuba was able to completely crush the oligarchs of yesteryear. Venezuela is still in that process. It's a bloody class struggle that plays out in all of the different ways that we've enumerated. But how beautiful to arrive in Caracas and to see billboards where they're quoting Che is saying, no se puede confiar en el imperialismo ni tantico, así. Across Caracas in Venezuela, you'll see these billboards quoting Ernesto Che Guevara saying, we can never trust imperialism, not even a little bit. There's other beautiful signs that say, aquí no se habla mal de Chávez. We're not gonna, in a non-integrous way, we're not gonna attack Chavez. So there's all this different efforts to convert Venezuela into what Ernesto Che Guevara called a gigantic school of socialism. And that really speaks to everything that Cira laid out in terms of the zeitgeist, the spirit, the elan of the communes. The people's militias, the people's army, this is a very ideological army, the Bolivarian militias, and the collaboration with other actors across the world, like the Russians. Who could forget when the Russians sent more than 100,000 Kalashnikovs to arm the Bolivarian militias? Another reason why the US and NATO waged this war on Russian geopolitical interests, weaponizing Ukrainian nationalism and fascism in Kiev. A point I want to make is that in 2024, Caracas is really one of the truly independent epicenters of revolutionary thought. I think Beijing could certainly make a case that Beijing is the revolutionary epicenter of internationalism as well. Not that it's a competition. We need as many revolutionary epicenters as we can come up with. I've had the good fortune for the past 10 years to travel to Venezuela once or twice a year, almost every year, for different internationalist congresses, including a congress bringing together social media voices and influencers and journalists so that the Venezuelans and all of their allies could train a whole new generation to combat the informational war. As the Haitians and the Venezuelans will often remind us, the most important front in the war on Haiti or on Venezuela is the informational war, is the communicational war, is the media war. It's truly a David versus Goliath struggle, because we know who owns CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And how amazing that Telesur, despite all of the sanctions and the economic sabotage, continues to stand. I've been working for 10 years with VTV. That is the domestic iteration of Telesur, if you will. That's the national news in Venezuela. And when I say work is a revolutionary. As a volunteer, as an internationalist, I've never received a dime or a bolivar from the Venezuelan state, despite what our detractors will often try to go to. Oh, he's an agent of Maduro and he's an agent of this, which is, you know, the ultimate compliment for any anti-imperialist in Las Americas. I was also part of the founding of the International University of Communication, which was an attempt by the Venezuelans and their allies across the Americas and across the world to build a truly proletarian internationalist university, a robust structure to rival all of the lies and American dreaming that comes out of the Ivy League schools. So the Bolivarian Revolution is alive and well, despite how many attempts to sabotage it, to upset it. Anyone who's been to Venezuela or who will travel to Venezuela will feel the Chavista spirit of the people across Venezuela, which continues to inspire us. I hope we can do make every attempt to send more of our young organizers so they can live the Bolivarian Revolution for themselves. And because it's very infectious when you come back from Venezuela and you walk through them gates at JFK or whatever airport, it hits you right in the face once you start seeing all of the capitalist propaganda for Heineken or whatever they're advertising. So I'll end by saying that those of us who dream of and fight for and organize for a multipolar world, Caracas, the Bolivarian Revolution, at 1/4 of a century is proof that we can overcome the most seemingly insurmountable of odds, because the hijos y hijas, the sons and daughters of Chavez, have done it, so we can do it anywhere. And that's why they hate Venezuela so much, because Venezuela is a lightning rod of hope and resistance for all of the working class people in resistance in Colombia, in Ecuador, and throughout the hemisphere. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Comrade Danny. That was superb. I guess we can open it now to audience questions. For those that are in the Zoom, make sure to raise your hand through the Zoom. You could see at the bottom of the Zoom this thing called reactions, and there's one of them that says raise hand at the bottom. So that's approach asking questions through that mean. That'll keep it organized, and we'll have the questions asked in the order at which those hands are raised. There's one that came in through YouTube already. It was more of a comment, but it was from Comrade Red Mays, who said the following: Latin American socialists, please understand, in the most likely re-election of Trump, U.S. covert active measures will continue against socialist projects, toughen your defenses against coups and lawfare funded by the U.S. That came in with a $10 super chat. Thank you so much, Red Mays. This is a People's Funded Institute, so these are the fundings that keep the institute afloat. So before we get to that, actually, Comrade Alan Freeman, distinguished economist, author of many important texts and articles, and professor at the research affiliate at the University of Manitoba, and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, amongst other book series with Pluto groups and other great things. I think he's going to tell us a little bit about the connection of the International Manifesto Group, which is excellent, by the way. If you haven't checked it out, make sure to check it out and sign the manifesto. The interconnection of the Manifesto Group and the Bolivarian process. So, Alan, please feel.
Just checking. Can you hear me? Wait a minute.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay now? Yeah, I'm not quite sure about this new tech that I've got. Well, I was originally asked to speak on behalf of the International Manifesto Group, but I didn't feel, in spite of my deep and long connection with Venezuela, there was much that I could say that would be add to what the speakers are saying. And I felt that the most important thing we did through International Manifesto Group was to help you guys put this thing on. And so I'm shout out for Midwestern Marx, shout out for Indicus Review and Venezuelanalysis. And I think this highlights the stage that we're going through, which is that people are starting to work together. And that's what we at the International Manifesto Group have set out to do from our inception, is to bring people together. And there was a stage when we were all fighting very much as individuals. We were on our own. And Venezuela was on its own. And the strange thing was, in our history, the very fact that Venezuela was on its own was what brought us together, because the roots, I can see some fellow Winnipeggers in the audience, the roots of the International Manifesto Group actually are due to the Venezuelan Revolution, because we formed something called the Venezuela Peace Committee, which was holding pickets at 25 below, which I think showed a certain level of commitment, but it brought together people who had been splintered, I think, by the previous experience of the debates and the fights on the left. And then here was something more important. And it had two things I would just mention that I think are very important, and then a question arising from that. One, when we were holding these pickets, cars would come by and they were hooting for us. Trucks were coming past, and if you think what the truckers have been doing in Canada since, that's something else. They were saying, yeah, we're with you. Venezuela was not unpopular with ordinary people. And we then had a team that went out into schools, and they were teachers, and they had a sort of a rolling show where they would go from one school to another, and they would do classes with the kids on what is propaganda. And they would just go through both sides of what was being said about Venezuela. And they would say, what they would, you know, when you're teaching kids at 12, you don't lecture to them like Eddie's prof. You just say, what do you think? And they say, do you think this is propaganda? Do you think this is propaganda? And they got a tremendous response. And one of the reasons was that, as you may or may not know, that Winnipeg has a very high proportion of Indigenous people in the schools. And there was, I think, an instinctive solidarity of Indigenous people in Manitoba and in Canada, and other working class people more widely, but particularly because people are sensitized to the treatment, colonial treatment of Indigenous people, that sparked a resonance. Now, since then, we've been trying in various ways to arrange what I would call, and it ties in with what Cira was saying about the communes, people-to-people interactions. We work very, very hard to try and get delegations of the First Nations, of Indigenous people, and it was just very difficult. Essentially because of all the obstructions which imperialism put in the way. That's the long and the short of it. There are other obstacles that have to be overcome because the whole structure of Indigenous government in Canada is extremely colonial and bureaucratic. And as Alicia Castro once said to me in Venezuela, the basic slogan is strike. Everything is urgent, immediate, and spontaneous. This is not what you're not allowed to behave that way if you're governed by the Canadian Indian Act. So we couldn't get through the bureaucracy. And when we tried to get the ambassador, there was a whole big fight because the British embassy was playing cat and mouse with us about whether Carlos Ron, for example, would be able to come and speak in Canada, and we didn't quite make it. But I think since then, this whole notion of a people-to-people interaction, of sending delegations to meet people in Venezuela, has traction, and I would urge that everybody think of ways that we can build on that. And it has extraordinary reach. We held collections just to send medicines to Venezuela, to the barrios, you know, and we had contacts in the barrios that we would say, you know, you're talking to real people here. When I say real people, I don't mean Maduro or Chavez are not real people, but people that you would have some instinctive sympathy was because they're at the same level in society that you are. And so, you know, you can trust where this is going. And of all people, because of the reputation they've got since in relation to what's happening in China, it's surprising. But the Mennonites, for example, which are a strong force in that area, one of the sort of displaced religious communities, very divided between left and right. But they actually, we have a picture of them proudly accepting a check for $1,000 from us to buy materials that were going to be going to Venezuela. So the reach of this is huge. And one of the things that imperialism does is it stops us talking to each other. So that's why I think this seminar was formidably important. And if one thing comes out of it that I hope for, it's that we will renew the effort. I mean, I'm now in England, but there are many Canadian friends here. It will renew the resolve to make those contacts, particularly between the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, because that was the great wound that was inflicted by colonialism on the Americas, was to sever the Indigenous people, not only to colonize them, but to sever them, sever their relations with each other. I hope that that's something we can look forward to overcoming. And once again, I thoroughly welcome everything that you've done. And it's just so great to meet you and see the faces. And I hope that sometime I'll shake the hands.
Thank you so much, Comrade Allen. That was great. So now I guess we can officially go to the question portion of our event. Again, for those that are watching us through Zoom, you can raise your hand through the reactions button and then ask your question. We did have one question from the YouTube. It came from Red Maze, who conjoined it with a $10 donation. And it's basically asking for Latin American socialists, but I guess in this particular instance for Venezuelan comrades, how are we going to be preparing for a Trump presidency that is likely going to intensify the war that the Biden administration has continued against Venezuela? we've heard Trump a few times boast about how when he was president, he was very, very close to getting Venezuela's oil. So what are the thoughts in terms of preparing the popular forces against hybrid warfare attacks in a more intensified manner from U.S. imperialism? I open
Cira,
it
you
up
want
to
to go
any of the
ahead? I can
panelists.
go ahead, but okay, I'm going on with that.
I mean, I imagine we have more or less the same thing to say, but go ahead. Yeah, I'll say something.
No, you go ahead. Go.
No, actually, I mean, I think that who is in DC does not, in the White House, does not make that much of a difference for us. The problem is imperialism, U.S. imperialism. Biden actually increased the amount of sanctions, unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela. So our problem is U.S. imperialism. Our problem is not Trump or Biden. Now, we should not be, of course, there can be different scenarios, but the scenarios go beyond the individualities that are in the White House. I think, I mean, at least that's my perspective. I think that it would be, well, what we've lived through Biden has been really horrific. And could it be worse with Trump? Maybe. It could also be worse with the second Biden presidency because he's a warmonger. Yeah, that would be my position. So I guess my call would be, as internationalists and comrades and communists that are listening to this, like, work to bring down imperialism and build socialism where you are, and that's what will really, really help us.
Yes, I agree with Cira. I mean, there's no difference between Biden and Trump, at least for our skin here in Venezuela. The imperialism is the problem. I completely agree with Cira with that, and I also believe that at least from our side, what we should do to counter any further attacks is to keep doing the work that we have been doing, building more civic military unity, which is the backbone of our defense, if you ask me, in connection with communes, bringing the leadership of the PSUV more touching ground more often, which I believe is a problem that we have here in Venezuela. And for the people outside Venezuela, I would ask them to don't fall so easily on those automatic solidarities that sometimes happen a lot up there in the north. I'm talking, for example, like in the case of this recent struggle or tensions we had with Guyana, and there were a lot of people in the north from the Black community, the Afro-American community that in my opinion felt very fast into the automatic solidarity of supporting the Guyanese people, not understanding very clear what was really happening and how complex is this, territorial struggle that we have with Guyana. And something similar happened with Marxists, with communists, and with this, confrontation that the PSUV has with the Communist Party of Venezuela. And I believe that there's also, in that all other front operates also an automatic solidarity problem that I believe people should avoid and get deeper into the realities of the Venezuelan communist, the Venezuelan Communist Party and the PSUV and Chavismo to really understand what really happens in Venezuela. So I know that this is a complex issue, but I believe that it's important to talk about it because that's part of the discussion that I know people in the North have around Venezuelan issues.
Thank you so much for those great answers, Cira and Jesus. I'm always reminded when questions like this arise of what uh, American communists can do to show solidarity with our international comrades. Things like this are essential. Attempting to win the information war, to debunk the lies of empire, are essential. But ultimately, the one of the most important, if not the most important thing we can do is develop our class struggle here to the point where we can be successful and overthrow imperialism, which is what is breathing down the necks of our comrades in the global south, both those that have already won the struggle for political power and are attempting to construct socialism, and those that are in the process of doing it. And there's this clip in the movie Examined Life that interviews various philosophers. There's one where Michael Hart, uh, somewhat of a traveler of Western Marxism, which for those familiar with our institute, we're very critical of. But there's a scene where he's in a canoe in New York, and he tells a story of going to Nicaragua to work with the Sandinistas. And he says, I get there to Nicaragua. I'm like, okay, how can I help? And the first thing they tell him is, excuse the French, but go the fuck back home and have a revolution in your country. That's what we really need of you. Lift imperialism over there so that we can have some breathing room to construct our socialist project here. And I think that for those of us in the U.S. and the belly of the beast, as Marty used to say, that's always something that has to be kept in mind. Kim and Ku has his hand up, or their hand up. I'm sorry. You can go ahead and ask your question, Kim.
Oh, okay. I was just interested in the connectivity, the interconnectivity question on whether Venezuela will be seeking BRICS membership. Thanks.
So any of the speakers, you can go right ahead and give us your thoughts.
Should I? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So yes, a lot of people have been recently asking whether Venezuela will join, would like to become part of BRICS and why it has not been for such a long time, etc. So what I know is that both Russia and Brazil have lobbied for Venezuela to be included in BRICS now that BRICS is expanding into BRICS Plus and has incorporated countries that are not, not at, that are farthest from socialism, if we can put it that way, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, etc. And what I know is that there is this probability, a very high probability, that Venezuela would be accepted as a member this year, or at least proposed as a member this year at the BRICS summit to be held in Russia. So that is the information that we have till now, and I think it's going to happen this year.
Thank you.
Just
thank you
to
so
add
much for
something else to that, I believe that I when last year was this discussion if Venezuela was going to be able to enter the BRICS club, I always saw that we were still not at the level of Iran or other countries with bigger, international or geopolitical influence. I'm not saying that we don't have it, but I believe that there are other countries around the world that also have an important way. So it didn't surprise me that we were not accepted in this first batch of expansion of BRICS. I hope, and a lot of people were talking that with the Argentinian declination of joining with the arrival of Milei, maybe the BRICS countries were going to invite Venezuela. So maybe that's what Sahili is talking about, and that's a possibility, of course. Now that Argentina decided, because of the neoliberal government of Milei in Argentina, not to join BRICS. So I hope that happens because it will give us more, how do you say that in English? It will strengthen us in our geopolitical play, you know, around the world. That's it.
Thank you so much. If there's no one else trying to tackle this question, we have an interesting one from the YouTube viewership. This comes from Pittsburgh Dude 87, who asks, sanctions on Venezuela impact migration to the U.S. What social strata Venezuelans are leaving, and are some migrants still supportive of the revolution? But do they find it too hard to survive? And then conjoined to that, what are the views of how do Chavistas view the countrymen that migrate to the U.S.?
I love this issue, but I want to give the chance to Cira.
No, I'll be very brief. I mean, from my perspective, I mean, people left because the material conditions were truly horrendous. Of course, there's also ideological elements, but mostly people left because they were really, really pasando ronchas, so really having a really bad time. Of course, well, actually, because there was also a question about class, the first wave of immigration, those were ideological migrants. When we talk about the first wave of migration, we talk about Chavez's years, and especially through 2016 or so. That was like middle sectors and bourgeoisie that was migrating. But in the more recent situation, which is probably what the person is asking about, many of the people who are leaving are people who have really enormous problems economically. They face real problems. Of course, there's also been an attempt to capture a successful attempt sometimes at capturing some of the professional sectors of society. That happens always when a country is in a very critical economic situation and there's migration. Of course, the countries, both neighboring countries and the countries in the global north, will do everything they can to capture the people who are, professionally prepared to, I don't know, technicians, doctors, engineers, etc., etc. That happens always, and that's happened with the situation with migration in Venezuela. So I would say that that's kind of like the profile very quickly when migration began to really grow in the early days of of this phenomena. Actually, within Chavismo, there was a discourse that I found very problematic and that has been fortunately corrected, of saying, oh, you're apatridas, you're leaving because you don't have a commitment to your country. And of course, I want people to stay here. We want people to stay here, but we have to understand actual very real and difficult conditions that people face. So I think the trigger has been mostly economic. There's been other elements too, ideological, political elements, but mostly the trigger has been economic. And right now, within Chavismo, there's of course an understanding that people who have migrated and still migrate, although the intensity is less, and there's actually been some people who've been coming back. But there's, it's understood within Chavismo that the phenomenon of migration is triggered by an economic situation that is of course triggered itself by the blockade, by the imperialist blockade.
Let me add a few things to the question, if I can. Are you done, Cira? I believe that Cira is ready. So I believe that, I mean, what Cira says is absolutely right. Many people has been leaving Venezuela, especially in recent years, since 2015, 16, because of economic reasons and not political ones. And that's why Venezuelan authorities talk not about asylum seekers or refugees, but about economic I don't know the word exactly, but Venezuelan authorities rejects the term of
may I talk?
humanitarian. Who is there? Danny.
No, that was someone. Was
Okay, okay. About the political use that international migration organizations has been given to the term humanitarian refugees, because this is mostly an economic. These recent immigrants are economic refugees, escaping from the harsh economic conditions that we are facing in Venezuela. But it's important to highlight that at least since 2012 or 2013, many Venezuelan migrants moved to South America, invited by far-right Latin American presidents, because they wanted to increase or make bigger the humanitarian crisis, narrative. And after they reach the maximum level that they could receive of migrants, they, all these xenophobic incidents and exploitation incidents against Venezuelans began. And with it also began the economic crisis in South America. And what is happening in recent years, in my opinion, and from what you read and listen to friends, family, people is that many people in South America, Venezuelan migrants that decided to move to South America, and they are either coming back to Venezuela because we already have been for 2 or 3 years showing economic recovery and signs. No, I'm not saying that the Venezuela economy is perfect, but there are some indicators that says that the economy is improving a little bit in Venezuela. And other group of Venezuelan migrants in South America have decided to move north, to either to the US or Europe. And those are the migrants that you see crossing, in the majority, in my opinion, crossing the Darien Gap, or engrossing the number of migrants in the borders in the south of the US. And this is going to be, in my opinion, a very complex issue, especially for the US this year, because the migration issue right now in the US is an important issue, and we are in a presidential race this year in the US. And actually, in recent days, when the U.S. threatened us with with resuming the sanctions on oil and gas, the Venezuelan government threat back, response to that threat, saying that we were going to stop the migrant repatriation flights that we agreed a few months ago with the U.S. So this is going to be a very busy issue this year, if you ask me. And of course, this issue of the Venezuelan migrants is mostly the result of U.S. sanctions, U.S. blockade, U.S. aggression against Venezuela. That's the reality. So it's important to understand that.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for that response. With the issue of migration, as a Cuban, I can say that there's always push-pull factors, right? There's the objectively difficult conditions created by imperialism, and there's also the pull factor of the fact that, this is the imperial hegemon, and ideologically we present the life that Americans live here in a way that's completely baseless. I've heard often a form of false consciousness in some Cubans who think that, in the US, it's just you're in the pool all day drinking Heineken and eating steak. And that's the farthest from the reality that the American people are experiencing, a large chunk of them, which are suffering quite direly. It's interesting. Let me tell a short, amusing story. I was at the end of last year in Mexico for a series of panels at LUNAM. And there was a panel going on before the one that I was a part of. And there was this individual that was introduced with a grocery long list of a biography. There was almost 2 pages worth of biography in his introduction. And this was a supposedly specialist on issues of migration, graduate of the University of Miami. And when it came to the topic of migration from Venezuela, he just reduced it to the fact that socialism is a failure and people are escaping socialism, which it's very ridiculous. And after I asked him, a somewhat tedious question using the statistics that come from international organizations about how the sanctions, the unilateral coercive measures have affected Venezuelan reality and affected migration. He just said, no, he just dismisses it. There's no argument that they can give back to you. And that argumentlessness is reminiscent and an archetype of how the imperialist discuss the issue of migration, specifically from Venezuela and from other socialist countries, and how they utilize it in their toolbox against socialism. With Cuba, they close the frontiers and they prohibit travel out of Cuba and people getting visas so that they jump into the ocean, and then they could use lanceros, people that end up going on rafts to Miami. They could use that as atrocity propaganda, and they do something very similar, I think, with Venezuelan migration. And this is another central point that has to be combated, because the issue of migration in the U.S. plays such an important central role in political debates in a way that no perspective actually takes into account the reality of imperialism and the interests of working people, both migrant workers and working people at home. But we'll go to Kim and then Alan for the next questions.
Okay, thank you. Just a brief question. How disruptive is the Machado electoral bid in Venezuela right now? Thank you.
So anyone feel free to speak.
Yes, I believe that what I was saying before, trying to cover Don brief interruption, it was that she doesn't have an important support base. She won't have more support than the support that any other right-wing candidate has had in recent years, if you ask me. There's a lot of bluff in mainstream media about her support base, but it's inflated, it's artificial. And you could see it a few days ago. I believe that it was this week, early this week, or at the end of last week, she called for a protest in Altamira Square in the east of Caracas, where the rich people live. And the place was almost empty. And she wanted to create this, because she did it a few days after the Supreme Court ratified her disqualification. And she wanted to make a big noise out of this demonstration, and almost no one shows up. So that gives you that might give you an idea of how supported she is. Of course, she will have the support of the strong right-wing Venezuelan base, which should be somewhere between 2-3 million people, and maybe some people in the middle. But she does not represent an important threat to Chavismo, if you ask me.
I'll add something very quickly. Totally agree with Jesus, but I would say that it's interesting because the Venezuelan opposition, well, of course there are problems, and of course there are people who are not satisfied with the current situation. Some of them cannot analyze the impact of the blockade, but there are also fair criticisms to be made. But the Venezuelan opposition is tremendously weak in Venezuela right now. It's very fortunate. Internally, of course, they have a pretty important ally and a very powerful ally. But for instance, when during Guaido's self-proclamation that was in, well, if you're talking about like 2019, for example, around that time, Guaido was, even though I also agree with the analysis that Jesus makes about Guaido, but he was able to bring people out to the streets. And even in 2017, during the Guarimbas, there were, these violent fascistoid protests in the street. There was a certain capacity to mobilize by the opposition, but right now the opposition is totally demobilized because they've lied so much. They've told so many stories. They also amongst themselves have many problems. So I guess in that respect, the situation is not the worst, in the sense that people have lost, people who might have supported them at one point, they do not support them, or they do not trust them anymore.
I'd just like to add something. It's not about exactly about the Venezuelan internal situation, but since Kim mentioned disruption, I think the greater disruption will come from the US, because it has already threatened that since the US candidate, that is Maria Corina Machado, is not being allowed to run, they will just, well, harshen the sanctions, because I will not say reimpose, because the sanctions were never removed in the first place. They remained. Only they were relaxed a bit here and there. A few sanctions, not the 931s, out of which 566, if I'm not wrong, come from the US. Anyway, so the bigger disruption will come from the US in the form of more economic hardships. But I think that over the last few years of the blockade, Venezuelans have learned how to get by and how to fight back against them. So yeah, I don't think there will be that sort of disruption. They could, I mean, Machado's people, the opposition, which is divided and weak, as Cira already mentioned, they might try to have some guarimba or anything, but I don't know if they will have that much support that they had in 2014 or 2017. It might be even smaller, because just like Jesus mentioned, nobody showed up even in Altamira. So if it happens in Altamira, just imagine what could happen in the poorer sections of Caracas or in other cities and towns.
Excellent. Thank you so much. With that, we can go to our next question from Alan Freeman. Alan, you're
Hi.
muted. There you go.
Yeah, it's okay. You can hear me now. Yeah. So I just wanted to come back on this question which I raised and see if we can have a bit of a discussion. What is the most effective form of solidarity in the opinion of our speakers? And I raise that because there's some misunderstandings are possible. I wasn't implying when I was talking about these direct contacts between peoples that there's any kind of spontaneous, reliable solidarity. And I take the point that can be misused. What I'm saying is there is actually a higher degree of support for Venezuela in the imperialist countries than you find certainly for Russia, for example, or for even Israel until very recently. What the tactic of the imperialists towards the friendship of the people of the North America and Europe, which they spontaneously feel is misinformation. So in my opinion, information and correcting information is one of the most important tasks. That is education. That is actually, and discussion and dialogue, and actually going to people and say, look, you got this wrong. You don't understand what's happening in Guyana, and here's what's really happening. So I think one way that one can do that is to take people who actually do sympathize, like a surprising number of MPs, trade unionists, indigenous people, and say, go there, hear, and come back and tell. That's my sort of suggestion. Maybe things have moved to the point where that's not going to be the most helpful way, but I just want to run past you sort of a bit of my personal history. I first came across Chavez in 2002 when I was in Argentina, and I was campaigning against for the relief of the Argentine debt, which at that time Gordon Brown was in head of the IMF committee that was imposing this debt. And the relief of the Argentine debt is actually still, in my opinion, one of the most burning questions. But the revolution that will not be televised happened while I was there. And you could see from the reception on the Buenos Aires streets the great sympathy there was for this. And I came back and I was saying to my British comrades, you don't understand, something really new is happening, not only with Kirchnerismo, which I think left Peronism went through a very different trajectory to what orthodox purity fetish people thought, but also with Chavez. They didn't understand because it has to be communist, it has to be Cuban, it has to be Soviet. No, I'm saying this is a Bolivarian process, it's unique and you have to understand it. And the first meeting we had was just an information meeting with Julia Buxton. We filled Conway Hall. because she just explained, look, there is the Blue Book, it's the Constitution, 92% of the Venezuelan people voted for it, and Chavez is going to implement it. And just that message was universally understood at the time. The orchestra, I was on the board of the orchestra in Winnipeg, and they actually still run a sistema. They run a sistema because the reputation of the sistema method and what Venezuela has achieved with the youth through the sistema program is widely respected. So all I'm saying is there must be ways of drawing on that respect. And I think the whole Machado thing, the audience is not Venezuela, the audience is the West. What they constantly try to do is to correct what is actually a spontaneously quite relatively, I say relatively compared with Russia or Israel in the Al-Aqsa flood days, it's still relatively high. And this penetrates even the parliamentary parties, even the trade union institutions, people who won't touch Palestine with a barge pole, or certainly Ukraine, right? So the constant flood of propaganda, this is what we have to work together to counteract by getting out the truth. So the method of direct contact is just one method, and maybe that's not the appropriate one at the present time. But I have to feel that my own feeling is the task of solidarity in relation to Venezuela is one, lift the sanctions, get the gold out of London. I'm back in London now, so we'll start working on that, right? But let Venezuela sell its oil on the market, stop the economic strangulation of Venezuela, but correct the misinformation. So that, but things have moved on a lot since the last time I was in Venezuela. Well, that was 2 years ago. I'd very much like to hear the speakers say what they think we should be doing to take this movement forward. And that was the sort of purport of my question, not to say, any reliance that some of the very forces that are going to be captured by imperialism every time, including parts of the black movement, can be relied on. It's what should we do with those people we can rely on? That was more sort of the drift of my question.
I will answer very fast before Cira that you need to support the Venezuelanalysis and Orinoco Tribune and Midwestern Marxist and International Manifesto Group, organizations that help people see a different side of what happened in Venezuela. And our work is like David versus Goliath. I mean, it's like we are fighting against mainstream media. And it's not an easy fight, but we do that work. So I know that Cira might say something also about that.
I agree. No, I think that's incredibly important.
Sure, I would agree about that. Helen, you brought up the idea of brigades, and I think the idea of brigades is a very good idea. Of course, they have been happening. Last summer, there was a Code Pink Brigade that was quite wonderful. It brought about 30 people, and they went to different communes. So that kind of space of building, like the tejiendo, building relationships, weaving real relations between the people who might be solidarious in the global north and the people who are building a real alternative here is important. Of course, there's a lot of people who come through here, to go to congresses and things like that, and those things are important. But those initiatives will not really show you how people are living and how people are building an alternative. I'm talking about, seemingly every 3 months we have a massive congress here, a massive meeting here where internationalists come and stay in fancy hotels and hear each other talk and hear some Venezuelans talk. But I actually would promote a different kind of solidarity where people come here as the Code Pink Brigade, where people come here and actually stay in the communes and actually learn about what is happening. Because really the best way to be internationalist is I promote a kind of internationalism that doesn't only focus on being on supporting the government, but specifically supporting the people that are building an alternative. And it's a radically new alternative. It's a beautiful alternative. There's so much to learn. There's so much to learn here. The communards are thinking people. I mean, they are people who are kind of like studying, doing, reflecting. There's a real practice that is very amazing in the communes. So I think that that's actually one, I wouldn't say it's a key element about how to build internationalist ties. But I do think that that would be an important thing. Actually, from Alexis Vive, the organization that I'm part of, the Communal Panal, we are actually working on generating conditions to receive people from when they come from abroad, because it's very important for us to also build, to not to break down the isolation that imperialism tries to impose on us. So just that would be, of course, one piece. I do believe that the main thing that people can do in the global north is to build a socialist alternative wherever they are and to fight against imperialism. That's I'm sure of that. I also hope that people will support the outlets like Orinoco Tribune and Venezuelanalysis that do work from here, from the ground, covering what's going on in Venezuela. And then there's other things like maybe brigades or different exercises of solidarity, of course, like sending medicines, which many people did at one point. Things like that. All that is important. I mean, I guess there's not a single roadmap for internationalism and solidarity. There have to be a lot of elements, and I do agree with Helen's idea, if I understood him correctly, of promoting more brigades. That would be from the bottom, that it would not be about certain sector of people who are committed coming here and talking amongst themselves, but really talking with the people. I think that would be the key.
I wanted to comment too on something, or on the importance of these anti-imperialist outlets like Venezuelanalysis and Orinoco Tribune. Because like when I first wanted to start learning about Venezuela, I felt like I was drowning in Western media propaganda. I couldn't get any source that wasn't comically biased and imperialistic. And then I had a professor point me towards Venezuelanalysis, and it made it so much easier to have an outlet that cut through all the propaganda and gave me the real information that I wanted. So then I was able to take that information, learn about Venezuela myself, develop politically myself. And then, like a year later, we started the Midwestern Marx Institute, and we had a video on the super popular social media app TikTok, responding to Jordan Belfort, the main character of The Wolf of Wall Street. He's this big time Wall Street shareholder, wealthy guy, who's like notorious for getting rich by stepping on other people. But he made a video attacking Venezuela, and I made a response to his video. And I think to this day, it's probably the most viewed video we've ever had. It got like 10 million views, telling Americans that what you've been told about Venezuela is a lie. So, I mean, I think that experience kind of shows you educate one person, and then that person might go educate 15 million people. Without Venezuelanalysis, that video with 15 million views never happened. So it's kind of like you can have an exponential growth, and yeah, we're fighting against Goliath, but the difference is they have to lie and we have the truth on our side. So yeah, just want to agree with that. Support the work that these organizations are doing.
That's beautifully said. We have some people in the comments on YouTube talking about how we found our organization through that video. And yeah, but by the way, I just wanted to say something in reply to Alan. It's very good to hear that even though Canada in many ways is lockstep with the U.S. empire in many geopolitical issues, there's some issues where there's divergence, and it seems like, for example, Cuba is one of them. Canada consistently votes against the American blockade at the United Nations General Assembly. And it seems like from what you're saying that at least at the level of the people and even some politicians, Venezuela might be a point of disagreement too, because in the US, I wish we had that. Frankly, even the so-called socialist progressives within the Democratic Party, they're speaking about Venezuela in terms of a dictatorship, and their socialism is Scandinavia. Um, and in terms of the people, frankly, because of the uniformity, the homogenous character through which Venezuela is depicted in the American media, both the so-called left and the so-called right, you have these reactions when you talk about socialism, which is the most famous one is "What about Venezuela?" which is the title of Eddie's forthcoming book that details the sort of transformation that he's had. So it was just interesting to observe how in that area it seems like Canada is also not in lockstep with U.S. imperialism, or at least some folks. Um, there is one question that we have from the audience that we can get to before we head out. I think it's perhaps a little bit more directed at Cira, as it deals with the communes, but Jesus, perhaps you could also comment on it a bit. This is from Marxist Saw, a regular of the Institute. They ask, do you believe that the communes in neighborhoods that began under Chavez allowed the working class to break out of its timidness that capitalism left it with and learn to practice their own power? If so, can you explain examples and details that somebody in the US could use in helping the working class here come out of its timidness that this capitalism has left it in? So how can the sort of worker empowerment
The
that we
word
see
is
with the
timidness.
what was
The
that?
word is the word is timidness.
Timidness.
Timidez.
Timidness. Yeah. Timidez.
Timidez. Okay. Sure. Of course, capitalism generates situations of enajenación. I'm too tired to think about the word of, like the different for alienation. Everywhere. Now there are different, like cultural elements everywhere. I would not say that the Venezuelan working class would be characterized as timid even before the Bolivarian process. I think these are people, the Venezuelan people, it's a very rebellious people that it would be hard to characterize the Venezuelan people as timid. But of course, that doesn't mean that there's not that the Venezuelan pueblo, the working class, doesn't carry a lot of problems from coming from capitalist and bourgeois ideology. So how basically it is precisely because the Venezuelan people are not timid, I think, that the Bolivarian process happened. In this, there was a rebellion. It was a popular rebellion that didn't happen in a particular period of time, but that happened over a long period of time. An anti-capitalist and later anti-neoliberal rebellion that eventually led to Chavez coming into power and the Bolivarian process, and then socialism and the communes. So, having said that, I would say that of course there's a lot to learn from the Bolivarian process and specifically from the communes. The working class in the global north, oftentimes there are certain conditions of real privilege when compared to the global south. At least some sectors of the working class have some real situations of privilege compared to the working class in the global south in general, and in Venezuela in particular. And I think that that's what leads, in some cases, to the timidness of some of the working class in the global north, in addition to fears and like education and the ideology machine that is very active all the time. So what can people, the working class, learn? I mean, first of all, I think the main thing that the working class in the global north can learn is that it is actually possible to build an alternative. I mean, I think that that's the main teaching. It's actually possible because we've actually seen it and touched it with our own hands and lived it with our own bodies and heard it with our own ears and talked it with our own mouths. So that would be the key thing that one could learn, that a worker from Comrade could learn here, that it's possible to build an alternative. And of course, I mean, there's, there are things that are specific about the Bolivarian Revolution that cannot be translated to other places, and there will be things that if you come here, you will learn, and you might be able to translate it to your own context. So while I did argue in my presentation that I believe that the commune is actually a roadmap, or that my hypothesis is that the commune is a roadmap for socialism, not only here, but everywhere else. Of course, the way that the commune conforms in every country, in every society, will be different. So we do not have We do not have the formula. We are still trying it out. As we build communes, of course, we make mistakes, and people who come here, people who were interested, they will learn as much from our virtues as from our mistakes to build a future socialist society elsewhere.
Thank you. That was excellent. Jesus, do you have any comments on this, or do you think?
No, I agree with Cira. I believe that the communal experience in Venezuela has its own, characteristics that cannot be extrapolated to countries like automatically. But I believe that they are perfectly doable in other countries from the perspective of the communal councils. I know that in the US there are, experiments on that kind of, communal council experiment, and that's perfectly possible. If those initiatives had government support in the US, that will be great, but the reality is that they are sabotaged constantly. But people in the US should be able to bypass that sabotage to connect with different, communal council-like initiatives in the US or in Europe to try to create communes, to try to create federations, and try to build socialism without the, the tutelage of the state. That's what I will add.
Absolutely, that component that working class people can actually become the masters of their own fate, which is another way of saying that we can actually have real democracy. It's great to see not only the potential of it, but its actualization in countries like Venezuela, like China, like Cuba, and an actualization that's done under pressures that I don't think we will necessarily have in the US, given that we are the imperial hegemon that creates these pressures for these countries. So there's definitely a lot to learn and a lot to be inspired by as working class people and communists here in the US. Well, we have arrived at the end of this terrific panel. I hope, as I promised at the beginning, that you were all able to enjoy it and find many insightful things in it. I think the presentations were outstanding. I would like to give the floor over to the various speakers to give us a little bit of updates to plug what it is that their organizations or them as individuals are currently doing, so that the audience has a chance to go check out their work. So maybe we can start with the order that we went in through the speakers. So Cira, if you want to tell us a little bit about your work and what your organization is up to currently and how people can find it.
Eddie was opened up if he wants to go, but I can go. I mean.
Oh, Eddie, that's right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm from Midwestern Marx, the same as Carlos. So, yep, and I'm getting ready for trying to make the 2024 Olympic team. So that's what I'm busy doing right now.
It would be great, as we all hope, to have a communist up there with the American flag debunking imperialism. I think that would be a dream come true in many ways. But as far as the Institute, I can just say that our publishing press has a lot of projects for this upcoming year. Follow our website where we're consistently posting a wide variety of articles, and we're also doing classes now. We've been doing classes for more than a year on a variety of different topics, whether it's Marxist philosophy and theory, or the history of various revolutions, or educating against this horrendous state of genocidal affairs that we're seeing unfold on the people of Gaza by the Zionist state. So you can check out all of our work there. And if you want to help us financially, you can always do so by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. That's also, we wouldn't be able to do a fraction of what we do without the contributions from our grassroots base. But Cira, do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing?
Sure. I'll focus on Venezuelanalysis. As I've already said, I'm committed to the communal project, and but I will not go into what we do Panal Commune that will come at another time in another space. Venezuelanalysis has been at it for 20 years. We focus exclusively on Venezuela from an anti-imperialist and Bolivarian perspective. The content that we produce is diverse, from briefs to interviews, videos, publications, infographics, etc. And it's necessary to keep this. I think it's necessary to keep these spaces open because they are a window to what is really going on in terms of, for us, for instance, one of the things that we do, since I've been talking about communes, and I already mentioned this before, we've been producing this series on communes that are in-depth series telling the stories of the commune arts in their voices, and also documenting them photographically. We've been doing that. Venezuelanalysis is publishing it, and here in Venezuela we published the books, actual books on each commune with the Observatorio Antibloqueo. But going back to Venezuelanalysis, yes, please support us, support the work that we do. There's Patreon, you go to the website, you'll see all the stuff. We couldn't do it without people's support. So yeah, that is one little piece in the international support of Venezuela that may be possible for some of our listeners. So yeah, and thank you, folks. This is probably a goodbye. So thanks so much for having this space. It's been really good to debate and to present some of our ideas. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Cira, for coming on, and also check out Escuela de Cuadros if you speak Spanish. It's an excellent project where leading Marxist thinkers are interviewed on various very pertinent topics of Marxist theory and politics. Thank you so much, Cira, for joining us. Jesus and Saheli, feel free to tell us a little bit about what's going on in Orinoco Tribune and how the people can support your work.
I was thinking that Saheli wanted to say something, but maybe she say something after me. Again, I mean, it's important, the support that we receive from financial support that we receive from people in the North. I mean, Venezuelanalysis and Orinoco Tribune and many other outlets out there, most of the time, work with our nails, to try to do our work. And some people take for granted or believe that for some reason we have plenty of resources, and the fact is that that's not true. I mean, the fact is that most of the time we need financial support, and it's important for people in the North to understand that. So in that sense, I believe that it's very important to remark and highlight that particular side of our work, because there are initiatives that get lost because of that. I mean, there are important projects that I've seen in recent years happening here from the South that end up dead because there's no financial support, and that's bad because, I mean, we don't need all the money that CNN or Fox News or whatever, mainstream media needs, but we need some support. So for that reason, I believe that is very important for people in the North, especially people in the North, to understand that to do our work and to make it better, to do it better, we need the support of you guys in the North. So I invite you to not only support Orinoco Tribune, to support Venezuelanalysis, to support Causachun News. That is one of those projects that I believe is struggling right now to stay alive because of lack of financial support. To support other anti-imperialistic projects out there that are not working hard to try to present a different perspective about what's happening here in the South. So that's my invitation. And of course, I love the work that you do, guys, in Midwestern Marxist. And of course, the work that the people in the International Manifesto group does is amazing. So I invite everyone to keep following you and to encourage people to follow you and to follow us. Un abrazo, compa.
Okay, so I'll just add that no, Jesus just forgot to say what Orinoco Tribune is anyway. So of course, everybody already knows it's news and opinion. Like we produce news and opinion pieces from a Chavista perspective, that has to be mentioned. And we not only focus on Venezuela, of course, it is the biggest focus, but not the only one. We also focus on Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the rest of the world, because, we think that Venezuela has an important position in geopolitics. These days, we have been like constantly putting out a lot of output on what's happening in Palestine, especially from people who are based there. I mean, based in Gaza, based in either the Gaza city or in the other cities in Gaza Strip. And, we're just like, these are from Arab, translating from Arabic to English and then publishing it. So a lot of it is like, primary source, it's coming directly from the people who are in the thick of the things, who are affected, who have lost their homes and families. So I just ask you people to follow Orinoco Tribune and follow all these news and opinion we are publishing, because we have to break the economic blockade. Information blockade. In this, that is a part of the hybrid war, not only against Venezuela, definitely against Venezuela, but all anti-imperialist forces in the world. So to break the information blockade, you have to read, get information from what is called primary sources. So Orinoco Tribune, you can just type Orinoco Tribune, find the website, and we are on all the social media, like we are on YouTube, definitely. We are on Facebook. I think that's the biggest source of our viewership. Twitter, which is currently X, and then Instagram, Telegram. Like we have a Telegram channel. We recently started a WhatsApp channel. You can find us there also, in Reddit. So we just try to be everywhere, so that if somebody like throws us out of one place, we can at least remain elsewhere and recover our things. And of course, I want to repeat about the financial support, because Jesus already told about it. It's that we all of us at Orinoco Tribune put in voluntary work. I mean, without any financial compensation, I would say. So like nothing. So we just do it because, I say that everything we do for love. So please follow Orinoco Tribune, follow Venezuelanalysis, and support us materially, ideologically, and in all other possible ways. Thanks a lot to Midwestern Marx for this wonderful opportunity to just talk about a few things. I mean, there is a lot more to talk about, but then we'd be here all day, all night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saheli. You're absolutely right. We have to be on all platforms. And for anyone that hasn't already, please make sure to check out the series of articles that Saheli did on the Guyana-Essequibo dispute. I think it's amongst the best work that has been done on that issue. Alan, do you want to tell us a little bit about the IMG and what's going on over there?
I think I've already said everything I want to say. I mean, this has been a wonderful event. It's reminded me of so many things, and it makes me want to just go back to Caracas and see all my friends again, and have you over here. That the amount of time that we've spent trying to simply allow Venezuelan speakers to come and present Venezuela's case, which is a big part of what solidarity requires, is enormous. Webinars have changed the atmosphere somewhat, so a lot of people are tuning into things like this, which is a big opportunity. So the conclusion I got is that we should renew the efforts to get speakers to come to our countries, and we should fight against the fact that they're not allowed to come, because they would get big audiences. But we should, in the meantime, use every channel and every opportunity that we have. And thanks to Orinoco Tribune Venezuelanalysis, I've been following for more than a decade now, and thanks to Midwestern Marx, who I've only encountered recently. And let's just continue working together, because we're going to win.
Thank you. Ending with a great note of optimism. This was also co-sponsored by the Critical Theory Workshop, whose all their relative links are put in the description to the YouTube video. So as are every other organization, co-sponsoring organizations links. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to all of those who watched live with us here on Zoom, to those watching live on YouTube, and to those who will be watching after the broadcast is finished. So thank you all. This has been another excellent.
Thank you from our part also.
Thank you so much, comrade. This has been another, I think, successful panel on the part of the Institute and our comrades at Orinoco, Venezuelanalysis, the IMG, Critical Theory Workshop. So hopefully there